So we're all busy, right? Any moms in the audience, right? You're preparing a huge presentation, trying to make dinner, your kids want to watch a little TV show. If you're not a mom, maybe your mom is calling you and saying, hey, where did you forget about your third cousin's birthday? And la tia Chachita wants to know what you're going to bring to Thanksgiving. So we're always multitasking, and that's why we need virtual assistants. And they're a godsend because you can plan a business trip, you can do all sorts of things, you can multitask. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. Lilian Rincon is at the core of the development of Google Assistant, and she's going to share some of her experience with us today. She has been selected as one of the top women in tech. Really, she's a trailblazer, so give her a huge round of applause. And we have a very special moderator for this fireside session, Natalia Moreno. She's the principal of Panama Collective and a board member of Latinas in Tech, and she will be conducting this interview.
Thank you. Yeah, when I agreed to this, we were going to do a fireside chat, and then somehow in the last month, now I'm doing a keynote for you first, and then a fireside chat. And actually, so I'm Lilian Rincon. I'm a director of product management at Google for the Google Assistant. For those of you guys that don't know what the Google Assistant is, it's basically like Alexa, but for Google, it's the thing that you talk to when you buy these devices like Google Homes, etc. So normally, actually, when I'm up on stage for Google, I come up and I've got devices and we've got demos. But today, actually, I'm going to try something new. Since I was thinking about if I was sitting in the audience, kind of like what would I want to hear. And so for the first time, actually, I'm going to tell you a very personal story and kind of share some of the insights that I wish I knew when I first started in my career. And so apologies, I have a piece of paper because I actually wrote this over the weekend. I wanted to share some very specific things. So first of all, this is me at age 2. Now that's a photo. That photo was taken in Venezuela. So I'm Venezuelan. Any Venezuelans out there? Now I'm half Chinese, half Spanish. I've got a very kind of interesting, unique history. My parents met in England. Somehow my dad is from Venezuela, so I was born there. And I'm an only child. And so from a very young age, because of my parents, I had this kind of unique situation where I had family all over the world. I got to experience many different cultures. Now, I grew up in Venezuela in the 80s, so I don't know how many of you guys lived there then, but it was a good country then, and it was a lot safer it is, let's say, than it is now. But I remember being 5 years old and my parents realizing that things started to get bad. And so they started to look at like what places could we move to. I remember one summer actually being in Vancouver and my parents fell in love with it, and so they applied for a visa. And by the time I was 9, we were one of the lucky people that actually got to get out before things kind of deteriorated, let's say a decade later. So I moved to Canada. Now my first language is Spanish. Unfortunately, I didn't speak Chinese. I never learned Cantonese or Mandarin. I wish I did. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So Canada, is English and French. Those are the two primary languages of the country. And it was the early 90s. I didn't speak either language, so I entered this program called English as a Second Language, or ESL. And it was the early 90s, so it was right before 92, before people from Hong Kong were not sure what was going to happen. And so if you just picture this, I was in a class surrounded by all kids from Hong Kong. So everybody spoke Cantonese. I was the only Latina, the only Spanish-speaking person. So it was a very hard and lonely time, to say the least. But it taught me about learning to overcome kind of some of these very difficult situations. And I think it was the first time, in reflecting back, where I realized this combination of perseverance with a passion and figuring how to get out of these really hard situations. And at the time, my passion, I was 9 years old, was like Madonna lyrics, listening to Madonna. Like prayer, I remember it. And actually, that's how I learned English, was actually taking, just back in the days, I'll tell you how old I am, right, with cassettes, with the little cassette thing, looking at the lyrics in the back of the cassettes. But that's how I learned English. And, at the same time, in the same way that I struggled to learn English, and this is very, I think, a very common scenario for immigrants when they move to a new country. Both my parents, my mom was one of those few people who was a computer engineer, unheard of, I would say, in those times. My dad was a civil engineer. They moved to Canada, but they really struggled to find jobs. And so it was really hard actually for my parents as well. And so it was so hard actually that within a year of me moving to Canada, we moved again. So we moved to Indonesia actually this time. This is where my mom was born. And I found myself, essentially I hadn't learned English yet, so I was speaking broken English, learning Malay, because that's the language of the country, and going to school 6 days a week, because I don't know how many of you guys have gone to school in Asia, but you go to school on Saturdays, and let me tell you, it sucks. But the silver lining was that I learned a lot of math, actually. Maybe because math, it's not tied to a language, so it was the one thing that I could actually focus on, and that helped me set up myself for success later in learning computing science, because a lot of computing science is based from math. So anyways, after 6 months of living in Indonesia, my parents realized that it was equally difficult for them there, and they realized actually, I think that for me, my education, the best country was Canada, so we packed up again. So within 3 years, I moved to 3 different continents, so I was back in Canada. And I would say that, for the next 5 years, things were semi-normal. So, I went to school in Canada, learned English, until at the age of 15. So something else happened. My mom, her mom had a stroke. She had to go back to Indonesia. My dad, his family was also ill. So they basically had to leave. So at the age of 15, they had a conversation with me, and they said, you know what, I think you're ready. You're ready to be on your own. And so I was basically finishing grade 10, and I realized, oh my God, I'm gonna have to figure out how to graduate on my own. So, they basically left, and I remember that summer actually because my birthday's in October, so I was 15. So I was 15, entering grade 11 with a car, a bank account, and I was getting a job as well because I wanted some more money. And I had a house, so it wasn't like I was left on, totally on my own. But at this time, actually, this was the second kind of like really hardship, right? Like, on the one hand, I don't know about y'all, but both my parents were super overprotective. So like up until that time, I was never allowed to have a boyfriend, not to go out, and all of a sudden here I am with a house and all the freedom in the world. So that could have gone very sour. But the one thing that, looking back, that was really fortunate for me is I was playing on a volleyball team, actually, and it was actually that volleyball team that provided the steadiness, let's say, when everything else in my life was changing. And actually it was through mentorship with my volleyball coach, and actually one of my volleyball friends' moms, my Auntie Vivian, everyone thought she was my mom because she became really close to me, that they allowed me to focus, actually. So at a time where I could have essentially, lost everything and just partied and quit school and whatever, they really got me to stick to it, and they provided the guidance for me to be able to graduate from high school with, both an academic scholarship and a volleyball scholarship, essentially, to every university in British Columbia, which was, in hindsight, kind of amazing considering the situation. I went on to be the captain and the setter. Not a lot of people know this. My Simon Fraser University volleyball team. And I was one of the few women to graduate with honors with computing science. Yeah. So after college, I went and became an engineer. That's what you do when you graduate. And I worked in many companies, from small startups at the time to larger companies, Microsoft, Google, etc. And when I was thinking back, it's kind of been this pattern of passion projects combined with sponsors, not mentors, but sponsors, that for me resulted in these sort of like real moments of growth in my career. So I'll share a few of those. So the first one is I moved to the US and started working for Microsoft in 2005. And at the time, Bill Gates was still the CEO. And I don't know how many of you guys know what Think Week is or have heard about it. So so at Microsoft, when Bill was there, he used to have this really awesome program called Think Week, where 1 or 2 weeks of the year, essentially anybody in the company, from the janitor to the execs, you could write a paper about anything. And he had a set of TLs, he had like 10 TLs, technical assistants, that would read all the papers, because thousands of papers would come in, right? The company was like 80,000 people. And if you were lucky enough and one of those TAs liked your paper, then he would read it. And if he commented on it or if he liked your idea, he would fund it. And actually that was one of the ways in which a lot of projects actually in the early days kind of started. So for me, 6 months into Microsoft, I think I was 25 at the time, 6 months into the job, and yeah, I didn't have kids, I wasn't married, I had all the time in the world. I looked around, I worked in the advertising platform for Microsoft, and I decided to propose a new marketplace, because at the time, we had this really heavy display ad where you had to work with agencies, and I noticed like it was so expensive for advertisers to get creatives or to get these ads built. And so I had this idea that what if we create this marketplace that would connect artists, like starving artists, or all these artists in the world, to these small to medium advertisers and create a marketplace. And actually, looking back, actually, one of the things that I did was I convinced my general manager to co-write with me. Like I wrote it, he put his name on it, but he essentially was my co-writer. And Bill actually ended up liking the idea, and from that I actually became a lead. I got an engineering team, within like a year at Microsoft, and it took 2 years, but it was the first successful product launch, if you will, that I had at Microsoft. And to date, actually, it is the creative asset management that they use. So that was Microsoft. I then proceeded to leave Microsoft in 2010. Came to the Bay Area, joined a company called Skype, only a year later to be reacquired back into Microsoft, couldn't get away. And at Skype though, thinking back, I also had a similar situation where, again, this wasn't part of my core job. It was just something that I had a feeling about. I started noticing patterns of, at the time it was like machine learning, this was 2013, was gaining traction. You started to see things like machine translation, and natural language processing starting to bubble up. And so I decided, again, not part of my core job, but I decided to write a paper, and then there was no Think Leap, but I just, decided that why not write a memo about the opportunity that I thought Skype had. At the time, Skype, really connected people to people for video calls. Probably today, that's what y'all think about. But I thought, hey, what if we took some of this machine learning and created some automated agents or bots, if you will, and in some ways connected people to businesses in this way. And so, again, I wrote this paper, and at the time in 2016, Satya Nadella decided that, hey, you know what, actually AI is a thing, bots are a thing, let's do this. And so I had an opportunity, if you will, to keynote at Build, which is one of Microsoft's conference. And eventually this led, I think, because I was on stage, it led to the Google Assistant team discovering me, and actually that's how I got recruited. So now at Google, I lead the features team. So all of the features that you use with the Google Assistant, that's my team. You can complain, or if you have any feature suggestions. And I kind of think about all of this experience and think about how we create products for everyone around the world. Clearly, Google Assistant is something that we want to take globally. But one interesting thing, actually, since joining Google that I noticed is, Google's very organic, it's very bottoms up, but one pattern, one framework, if you will, that they use is something that, in looking back, is something that maybe I've used all along but didn't realize they've quantified it a lot better. And so it's this sort of pyramid framework that if you think of your time as like 100% of your time, you think about your job, like 70% of your time, you should spend on your core job. That's actually what you got hired, that's the job description of the thing you're doing. 20% of your time, think about like opportunities, like things that maybe your boss didn't say or you didn't think you needed to do, but you think are opportunities for the team. And then 10% of the time, and I think this is where a bunch of my ideas came up, are these sort of like moonshots. And I love the term moonshots because it's this idea of, not just any idea, but what is like 10 times bigger than something that you're doing today. And in many ways, a lot of these moonshots are ideas that you think maybe will never land, and it's okay to spend time on those. So an example of one of these moonshots from the team was as we were thinking about Google Assistant entering what we call next billion user markets, such as India. We thought a lot about, in India, not a lot of people have smartphones like we do here. The cost of these phones is, it's tough for people, and so we thought, hey, what if we could reinvent the feature phone? I don't know how many of you guys had feature phones, but 10 years ago, before smartphones, we all had feature phones. And what if we put a giant microphone in the middle of this feature phone? And so we partnered with this company called Geo, and it's one of these, again, moonshot ideas that's been incredibly successful. I think we launched the phone at the beginning of the year, and now we're up to quadrupling growth. It's one of our top surfaces around the world. And what I love about this is, anybody from, people who have a lot of money to who don't have a lot of money can buy this phone. It really lowers the barrier to the technology. And what we're seeing in the data, it's really enabled us to attract a lot of women and a lot of seniors that wouldn't necessarily have an opportunity to interact with this. So okay, I'm wrapping up. So before I chat with Natalia, I just want to leave you with one final thought. These experiences in my life have brought me to this moment where I can look back and say that, regardless of where I was from, or the color of my skin, or that I'm a woman, at really important times I was able to take control of my life and direction. And for me, as I look back, I think it's a combination of drive, of passion, but also of having this, of building this strong support and sponsor network. Thank you.
Thank you so much. How inspiring, right? And I love Google Assistant. I hope one day it cleans the house, and then it will be awesome.